Hey Gardenstead fans, it's Kimber down in the garden. Today we are talking about how to make the most out of your space in the garden. Now we all wish that we had more space in the garden, more room to grow more fruits and vegetables and herbs and flowers, and sometimes you just can't. It is stuffed, it is there, you've got everything that you could possibly fit into the garden, but most likely you have more room in your garden than you think you have. So how can you make the most out of your garden space? Well, let's go walk around my garden and see how I have maximized my space and how I could do a better job and fit more things in. One of the ways that I maximize space in my garden is with companion planting, and this garden bed is a good example of that. Here I follow the Three Sisters, which is growing corn and beans and squash all together in one bed because they all benefit each other in different ways. Now, as the corn is growing taller, the beans, traditionally you would grow pole beans in this scenario. You grow the pole beans and the corn stalk actually acts as a support system for the beans to grow vertically. Now, this year I actually didn't grow pole beans. I grew bush beans, and that's because last year my corn was not strong enough to support the pole beans. So I went with the bush beans. But the bush beans are still doing a great job in here because they're adding nitrogen back into the soil. So it's still working out perfectly fine. And then the third part of the Three Sisters is growing squash. So I have squash all here as well. So I could have just planted corn, knowing that I wanted to grow corn this year. And I could have taken up the entire bed with corn. But I'm maximizing the space by interplanting the corn with the beans and the squash. And I also have more things in the garden as well. I have flowers to attract the bees, and I have herbs in here as well. And each of them plays a great part in the whole cycle of the garden by bringing benefits, nutrients, and some of the plants distract other insects from coming into the garden, and they all work together to make a wonderful garden. So if you have not planted multiple crops together, a really good idea is not to focus on one specific crop in a bed, but to put multiple crops in there that can work together and help each other grow. I just mentioned growing the pole beans vertically. Pole beans definitely need support. There are a lot of crops actually that can benefit from support and growing vertically. And growing vertically is a fantastic way, probably the best way to maximize the space in your garden. So behind me is one of the options that you can think of when coming up with how to grow vertically. So this is going to actually be a support for the cucumbers that are growing because cucumbers take up so much space. They grow wild if you don't contain them. So instead of letting the cucumbers grow along the ground and take up an entire garden bed, growing vertically is pretty much a must when it comes to cucumbers. So these are going to be full-size cucumbers that are growing behind me, and instead of letting them just go wherever they want to go, my plan here, I plant them at the very edge of this garden bed, and instead of leaving the empty space in the walkway, since this is the back of the garden, I've actually put a trellis in here that a friend built and passed along to me, and I'm trying to get the cucumber, and it'll follow. I'm trying to get the cucumber to go up, and I'm going to lace it throughout that, and this is actually an A-frame, so it's going to go up and over, and so I'll be able to access it from both sides and underneath it as well, because cucumbers just grow wherever they want to. And so I'm going to try and get them to go up over that. But I also have the fence that goes along the back of the garden, so I'm going to try and split them and have some of them go up and over and through the fence as well. Here's another example of vertically growing. I love these arches, and it's actually a really popular thing right now is for people to get cattle panel or different things and use it to create their own arches. So you don't have to go out and buy a particularly made arch from an expensive company. You can make your own, and these are from our own local supply company, and my husband has just put it over as an arch for us. But this is another great example of how to maximize space. I have 3 garden beds over here, and while I could have just used those beds, by putting in 2 of these arches, instead I was able to grow cucumbers over here. Well, these are my cucamelons, and they're going to grow up and over this side, and then I have watermelon going over here, and it's going to grow up and go over. So I've maximized my space by creating this entire space for growing, whereas otherwise I just have everything in those 2 beds. So creating your own arch is another fabulous way of creating extra space in your garden. I feel like this garden bed is a good example of maximizing space. Yes, there's still space in there that you can see, but I've used a lot of it. Instead of just planting the corn in this bed, you can see the beans and you can see the squash and zucchini, but I also have flowers growing along the edges as well. And this one, I wanted to point out that not only can you plant multiple crops in one bed, but you can plant them multiple times. So I have beans growing in here, but I didn't plant them all at the same time because I didn't want to be overwhelmed with beans. So I have a row of beans on the right that I planted, and then 2 weeks later, the row on the left was planted. So while they look pretty close in their growth, the ones on the right have been producing beans much longer than the ones on the left. So keep that in mind when you're trying to maximize your space. Don't plant everything all at once. Reserve some of your seeds and plant about 2 weeks later, and you'll be able to keep growing in your garden. And that way also, when your beans were finished from that first run, you're not just out of beans. Now you have beans coming in from the second planting. So a second planting is something, and continuous planting is something that you can do to maximize the space in your garden. So this bed is not only not a good example of utilizing space, it doesn't particularly look very pretty. Now the outline does with the flowers that were planted to attract the pollinators. And the elephant ears look pretty, the zucchini's looking good, so it's a nice look around the borders, but in the middle, it's pretty lacking. Now the first run of corn I planted didn't really take. So I've planted another bit of corn, and hopefully that does better this time around. But this bed didn't get the same chance as some of the others because this is the one that was the last that I pulled up from my winter gardening. Now I garden year round, so there's always something going over here, but this one kept vegetables growing the longest. So that's why it didn't get as many things in it. And then I've also already pulled up the lettuce from this bed from this spring, as well as the broccoli and Brussels sprouts that were in here. So now this bed is kind of in a transition. You can see there's a ton of space in there. It's not getting utilized. So I still have time that the corn is going to grow, and I have another row of beans planted in here, and I have lettuce planted in that long empty row on the right. So things will start growing again. But this is a good example of how I could have planted in a better timing. There are a number of ways that you can maximize the space in your garden. You can grow vertically, which is the best by far because you're taking everything up off of the ground and making space for more things. And you don't have to buy something pre-made and expensive. You can utilize things that you have at home. Utilize the fence that's surrounding your garden, just like I did, or build your own trellis. Whatever you want to do, maximize your space by lifting things up. And you can maximize your space by using it over and over. Don't just plant one time and let it go. Succession planting is a fantastic idea. Plant something, wait 2 weeks, plant again, and keep it going throughout the year, or at least throughout the summer. Now you can do all of those, make sure you've got everything going. You can also start crops in the same place that you know another crop is going to be finishing. And right now I just harvested my potatoes, so the next thing to go in is already ready. So you can start ahead of time and plant things, like I planted lettuce right when I planted my potatoes. I planted lettuce because I knew it would be growing, and by the time the potatoes vines had grown tall enough, they'd be providing shade. So I was able to have lettuce later in the season. So you can plant things too at different times. Just think about when each crop is going to be at its height and what it's going to need. If something needs shade, plant it below something that's taller, and then you'll have that providing the shade for your plants. That way you can maximize the space that's in the sun.